This episode is brought to you by Audible. Get your first month absolutely free by following the link below. The world's dankest, sweatiest, Reddit shitpostingest tryhard, Mr. 2015, ifunny.com himself, just bought one of the internet's 3 websites. So this week, we're looking at how capitalism ruined the World Wide Web. Just about everyone has a problem with the internet. We all use this necessary service for a million different things. And for many of us, we've even gotten to the point where we spend more time online than we do touching grass. Worldwide, both the number of internet users and the average amount of time spent online have gone up. So the problems that come with the internet are not just more obvious than before, they're also more important. They literally take up more of our lives. I'm not about to explain how the internet is important. You don't need me to hold your hand like that. But rather that this kind of significance is why changing things about the internet has become a political topic, with slogans like "break up big tech" picking up steam in recent years. Same with calls to tackle internet surveillance, censorship, misinformation, disinformation, lack of access, harassment, doxing, spam, and scams. Everything that's wrong with the internet is just too important not to fix. But it doesn't seem like it is getting fixed. Every year, tech companies will come out with a statement or ad campaign telling us that they're more committed to privacy, diversity, and inclusion than ever before doing not that and, say, totally fictional example of course, giving police access to a teenager's DMs so they can find out if she had an abortion, or turning over security camera footage to law enforcement without a warrant or consent, or churning out a new generation of far-right clowns by platforming the most ghoulish reactionaries. And it's not as though our governments are any better. As the Snowden leaks made abundantly clear, the internet has become a mass surveillance soup they can dip their ladle into at any time. For most of us, it feels like the internet is simply out of our control. We can complain all we want, but ultimately only something like YouTube can actually change what's wrong with YouTube. And YouTube can only do that while remaining profitable. It's not really for us to say what we want the internet to be. At the end of the day, the best we can do is tantamount to slipping a note in a suggestion box. And there's a reason for that. Ultimately, the root of most of the problems with the internet is that the internet is a business. But it hasn't always been. The internet that we know today began with the creation of a government institution called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was started by the US government in February of 1958. And that date is important because it's just 4 months after the Soviet Union had successfully launched Sputnik into space. Right in the middle of the Cold War, Sputnik's launch by the Soviets stoked fears of falling behind here in the US. And given the lack of innovation from the private sector to compete with what the USSR was getting up to, America decided it was time to prove capitalism was the superior economic model by getting the government involved. So the US created ARPA, later to be renamed DARPA to be clear that it's a military institution, then back to ARPA because it just sounds better, and never mind, now it's DARPA again. DARPA created what's usually considered the first public computer network, ARPANET, the thing that would eventually become the internet. A network between computers of DARPA's researchers it hoped to take to the battlefield one day. And the fact that it was created in the public sector had some important consequences. The first consequence is that it exists. The internet couldn't have existed without the public sector. Not just because that's how history played out, but because the private sector literally wouldn't have done it. By all accounts, the internet was far too expensive to create, took way too long to be developed, and was widely discredited as unprofitable by the private sector at every step of the way. And this isn't a hypothetical statement. The private sector literally didn't want to create anything like the internet. Years before ARPANET, the Air Force had tried to get AT&T to build its own version of a computer network without success. And even once ARPANET was fully built, at that point the most advanced computer network in the world, AT&T still wanted nothing to do with it. It just wasn't profitable to make something like the internet. So it had to be built without profit in mind. And the scale of how much creativity this kind of project took is often understated. Back in the day, a bunch of old fogies used to liken the internet to other public works projects like public roads, with names like the Information Highway. But that analogy only sort of works. The scale is completely different. The internet as a government project could only be compared to the highway system if the government, quote, had first imagined the possibility of cars, subsidized the invention of the auto industry, funded the technology of concrete and tar, and built the whole initial system. It is a public creation from the ground up. And that had other important effects. DARPA researchers were contracted out from a bunch of different places, but were required to work together under the same public roof, forcing the internet to develop collaboratively. That means with a common language and cross-platform compatibility right from the start. Signals and information needed to be sent over wires as much as they needed to be sent over radio waves, and with reliable, readable instructions in order for data to get to the right place, regardless of the path it would take. Unlike in the private sector, where the dominant logic is to lock people into a proprietary ecosystem and language, the public sector, and the necessity for the internet to be accessible by as many people as possible, meant universal codes. The internet was developed with a set of shared, universal protocols, and this was accompanied by the requirement from DARPA for different contractors to share their work with one another throughout the development process, under threat of losing their contracts, meaning that the first steps of the internet were deeply open source. The innovations made by one team carried through the system to be built upon by others instead of being shielded by competitive secrecy, as would have undoubtedly happened with a profit-driven, intellectual property-heavy capitalist model. And this kind of collaborative ethos and total disregard for profitability carried into the physical world too. To try to develop the reach of the internet, the government funded regional public networks throughout the US, more specifically for a collection of universities and institutions. Networks did not go where the money was, they were built where they were most useful and where they could most effectively be a true public service. By 1986, this approach had made ARPANET essentially too successful, and more people, researchers especially, wanted to get access to it. This led to the creation of another net, NSFNet. The idea behind NSFNet was to create what the author Ben Tarnoff, check out this book, calls the main artery of the internet. All sorts of different physical internet networks would be connected through a main, central, and importantly, public network. But here again, this worked too well. Thanks to the expansion of the network and the creation of a user-friendly hyperlink system, also a public innovation, not just researchers, but more and more everyday people were interested in getting on the internet. By the early 90s, demand had shot up, more than the system could handle. And suddenly, all those private sector executives changed their minds about this whole internet thing. After decades of rejection, capitalism wanted in. So it happened. Following the boom in interest of the 90s, the internet was privatized in two big ways. The physical infrastructure of the internet was privatized, and with it, the interface. First, the privatization of the infrastructure happened in 1995. That's because, right beforehand, a false dichotomy had started circulating in the American government. Either the internet would remain what it was, a network that largely supported researchers and had limited use, or it would become privatized and allowed to grow in scale to meet demand. This is a false dichotomy because nothing stopped the kind of scaling up promised by privatization happening within the public domain, except for neoliberal ideology. In 1995, Clinton was in the White House, and the political backdrop against which the internet was fighting for its life as a public service was at the height of neoliberal hegemony. Public services of all kinds were on their way out, because it was decided that unadulterated, all-encompassing market capitalism had won the ideological war when the USSR ended. Politics in the imperial core was no longer about debates over power and ideas, it was about technocratic, pragmatic solutions to precise, identifiable problems. Politics became about the nuances of capitalism and very little else. Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. Margaret Thatcher said there was no alternative, and Tony Blair insisted there are no left-wing or right-wing politics anymore, only politics that work. Privatization wasn't a political question anymore, it was an obvious answer. It was inevitable. The only question was about how privatization would happen, not whether it would happen at all. This is why, when telecom companies began lobbying for privatization, they got it. In the usual way privatization happens, the argument centered around competition, the battle for innovation, the lowering of prices. But the reality was that only 5 companies had the means to privatize the internet, and therefore, from the very first day the internet was privatized, it was under a market oligopoly. To this day, only 6 companies handle the physical infrastructure of the internet, and just 4 companies, Comcast, Charter, Verizon, and AT&T provide 76% of internet subscriptions. The public networks run by the government stopped expanding or were shut down entirely. And after billions spent in development, the government turned over the internet to profit seekers almost overnight. The consequences of this are obvious. ISPs have no reason to provide internet to everyone, only to those from whom they can expect to make a profit. Unsurprisingly then, 1/3 of Americans don't have broadband access, and those numbers obviously skew against the poor. Through a series of deals to stay out of each other's way, ISPs are free to price gouge. Just look at your internet bill and the tens of billions in profit a company like Verizon makes every year. It's why Americans pay some of the highest internet prices in the world, twice as much as Europeans, and usually for worse service. More recently, we've seen this trend go global. Companies like Meta and Google are getting into the infrastructure game too, buying up and building some of the undersea cables that take internet access throughout the world, especially in Africa, to develop both their reach and their control. But physical privatization was mirrored in the digital space. With internet access opening up with demand in the mid-90s, a flood of websites popped up to populate the web. This led to the infamous .com bubble. And from the fact that it's called a bubble and not the .com massive success / best event of the century maybe ever, you can probably guess where things went. By 2000, over 280 .com stocks, the first websites that had gotten big with investor money despite rarely proving they could turn a profit, crashed. $1.7 trillion disappeared from the stock market in just over 6 months, and it led most people to think that the idea of privatizing digital space was basically impossible. But it wasn't. A few companies had figured out that in order to make money on something that could just as easily be free, they would have to monetize activity. To do that, most large websites that survived the .com crash switched to what Tarnoff and another academic, Jathan Sadowski, call the online mall model. Either renting out space on their websites the way YouTube or Amazon do, or going a step further and collecting and selling the digital footprint you leave while browsing. The consequences are well known and pretty obvious. In a system where profit is driven by rent and data, the competition is over who can occupy more of the internet's infinite space. Every click is monetized, every minute on each website is counted, and everything users do is kept track of to sell to the highest bidders. Surveillance is not just the norm, it's more fundamental than that. It's the very fabric of the profitable internet. It bears repeating that if a service is free, you are the product. And the internet has also adopted the structure of capitalism internally during the privatization process. It's a place where unelected, all-powerful authority thrives. Like in a business, the most profit-hungry and wealthy have decision-making power over everyone else. Every decision about how to moderate a website like YouTube or Twitter isn't made through a process of collaborative deliberation and decision with a set of rules defined by and periodically reviewed by a democratic body. That should be obvious by now. The CEO and board of directors just do whatever they think will please advertisers and investors. In practice, when it comes to political content specifically, this usually means tolerating white supremacist reactionary content as long as it brings in devoted, regular, and profitable engagement. Up until the predictable point where this leads to a mass shooting or something like the storming of the Capitol in 2021. A quick crackdown later, and slowly the lucrative audience for reactionary content is allowed to trickle back in. And just like with traditional media, wealth buys influence online too. Since wealthy people tend to favor the things that make and keep them wealthy, this means that a heavily conservative and pro-capitalist bias dominates on the internet, with goons like Shapiro, Crowder, and PragerU working with much bigger budgets than anti-capitalist creators. And I'm painfully aware of these things as a YouTuber myself. At any given time, a channel like this could just disappear, and there's not much I could do. If these videos are no longer in line with some advertising strategy, them's the breaks. It's not up to me or you. And increasingly, it's up to fewer and fewer people. The internet market is consolidating. Facebook has bought around 100 companies, including of course Instagram and WhatsApp. Google's parent company Alphabet has acquired over 200, which of course includes YouTube. And Amazon Web Services, which tends to fly under the radar a bit, provides cloud servers to Netflix, Twitch, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and countless other websites. including those of some government services like the UK Ministry of Justice, all of whom therefore have to comply with AWS's terms of service. The ultimate authority over matters of censorship and general website function continues to concentrate more and more with the natural capitalist trend of mergers and acquisitions. And here I need to pause for a second because a lot of this feels really obvious to say. We've heard it a million times before that social media and other internet-y companies are exploiting our data and consolidating into fewer and fewer megacorporations trying to occupy as much of the online space as possible. But the reason I am so insistent is that not many discussions of these problems attach them explicitly to the shift to a capitalist model for the internet. And therefore, most solutions end up being short-sighted. Yes, there is a problem of regulation. These companies are absolutely acting against the interest of the public and should be regulated. And yes, there is a problem of monopoly. These companies are getting more powerful and harder to contest and contain by any means, both in the physical and digital space. But what is needed to fix these problems isn't just regulation and breaking up big tech. A capitalist system can always find the cracks in legislation and will always consolidate if given enough time, greasing the wheels of the legal system with its profits to keep doing it for as long as possible. We absolutely need these regulatory band-aids, but we can't leave the stabbing machine turned on. The problem is the capitalist organization of the internet itself. The fact that the internet can be a place for profit-seeking at all. And to really understand that, we can imagine what the alternative to the privatized internet could be. Already, on the infrastructural, physical side, we have seen what a deprivatized internet looks like. Over 450 communities in the country have publicly owned broadband. Instead of waiting for Comcast or AT&T to put down cables where it's profitable, local governments have built their own publicly managed networks. In places like my beloved Chattanooga, Tennessee, this has resulted in a service that is 85% faster than what Comcast offers, that costs half as much, and that reaches more than half of the area's internet users. There is no reason that internet infrastructure should be treated any differently from other common public services like water and electricity. And what works at a local scale could easily be coupled with the same effort at a national or even international scale, the way we saw with the first computer networks before privatization. A public office, year after year, for example, could have the mission to extend internet service to more and more people, without filtering out those who don't return a profit. Internet access has become too determinant in a person's life to be reserved for the wealthy. And the same approach could happen digitally. The internet can be deprivatized. Here, the idea would be to run things on the internet without the profit motive and with democratic structures. Both the creators or engineers of websites and their users could make decisions in concert about how the internet should actually look. This could happen through a nationalization process, a decentralization process, or more likely, a mix of both. Already, sketches of these kinds of networks exist. The problem is that a capitalist system prefers undemocratic corporate platforms. So it's not enough just to have alternative social media websites appear, but rather a broader societal effort needs to actively change the rules of the game so that these more democratic, not profit-driven alternatives can actually thrive. As with anything, these solutions will come with problems. Whatever issues still plague the rest of society will have their reflection on the new, deprivatized internet that we create. The goal isn't perfection, it's making an internet that actually works for ordinary people, not an internet that only works for those trying to make a quick buck at our expense. The internet is a big topic, and it's one that's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. It's such an integral part of modern life that imagining it being any different than it is today just seems crazy. I try my best to learn and understand as much as I can so I can share it with others. And one way I like to do that is by listening to audiobooks. I travel a lot for work, so I have plenty of time to sit on planes and listen to fascinating audiobooks on Audible. One great one that I recently listened to is Ben Tarnoff's Internet for the People. It's a fascinating look at the possibility of a deprivatized internet, a brighter, less predatory place where we users are more than just dollar signs. If you like to learn as much as I do, getting to pick a free audiobook every month is pretty nice. I don't think I can accurately convey how much I love Audible. I struggle to sit down and read a book, but with Audible, I can get through all the titles I've wanted to, all while running errands, or commuting, or traveling for work. It's completely changed how I learn. If you enjoyed this week's video, I highly recommend you check out Internet for the People on Audible. It's a fantastic listen. So if you want to help support my channel so I can produce more content like this, visit audible.com/secondthought or text second thought, one word, to 500-500. Sign up today and get your first month absolutely free. It really does help support me and my channel. Get started by following the link below or by texting second thought to 500-500. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous content by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.